Fellow tennis nerds, I hope all is well. Today I am here with Giri Nathan. He's a co-founder of Defector Media, winner of the Tom Perrotta Prize for tennis writing, and author of the upcoming book Changeover, dealing with the changeover in tennis that is happening from the big three to now maybe the big two, Alcaraz and Sinner. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the gear and other things. So how are you today, man?
I'm doing great. We just released the cover for my book, so I'm super excited about that. It's been nice to have a few weeks gap in the tennis off season, if you can even call it an off season, so I can catch up on my writing. But otherwise, excited to see them get back to it next year.
Yeah. It's always a bit of a weird period now where there's no tennis. Like if you follow it closely, You're like, what's going on now? It's just nothing to watch.
Yeah, next gen has been pretty good. I'll say that. I think a lot of people were excited about João Fonseca earlier in the year, and he's really delivering on that, at least in the two matches I was able to watch of him this week.
Yeah, have you been following like closely? Because I mean, the players are quite exciting. I would say, like I like Basavarelli, a pretty interesting player, but they're all like quite big ball strikers and really explosive individuals.
Yeah. I would say of the last few years, just looking at the next gen field, this was the time where I feel like, okay, I actually have watched a lot of these guys quite a bit over the year, and I have pretty good expectations for all of them. So I think it's a very strong field. I think, Basavarelli is a really cool player. I think Leonard Tien, also a lot of talent. A couple different nice stylistic conflicts in that field as well. But as you said, a lot of great ball striking.
Yeah, it's a sign maybe of more to come, and also that both Alcaraz and Sinner will be challenged, right? Like they might not have like the free lunch for that long. Like I mean, if you look back to the big three, there was a period Federer was like, okay, I'm so dominant, he's winning everything, and then Rafa came, and that kind of mixed things up, and then the end Nova came, and then it became like kind of a contest between everyone. So what prompted you to start writing this book? I mean, you've been a tennis journalist for a long time, I guess, follow the sport, but what was like your feel, like the light bulb over your head that's just like, I want to write this book?
Yeah, so I think the specific match was U.S. Open quarterfinal 2022 between Sinner and Alcaraz. And I always look at that match with a little bit of regret, because I'd had a super long tournament, just spending all day at the Open. And that was the day that I decided, okay, I'm going to go home and watch this one from my sofa. As many listeners may know, that ended up being an absolute epic 5-setter, finished around, I think, 10 a.m. And I just thought it was this really wonderful snapshot of the future, where you see these guys whose games certainly have some, influence from the big three, but also are very fresh and very original. And then when they get together and play each other, you can see each one is pushed to the limit. And some of the points in that match just will still play on my head. It's when I'm thinking about tennis. And from that moment on, I was like, okay, let's see what happens. We'll see how these careers develop. And I would love to write a book about a rivalry. And I think this could be a really compelling rivalry to pick. Obviously, Alcaraz kind of made the big steps in his career first. But then towards the end of last year, when Sinner was making his rise, I started thinking, maybe this is going to happen sooner rather than later. So I started putting together the proposal for the book. Once Sinner won in Australia, it started to feel like maybe there's some momentum here. And then I couldn't have predicted. That's when I finished the proposal of the book. But even then, I had no idea the season that was about to play out, where they split the slams between them, and Sinner had one of the great seasons that we've ever seen on the ATP. So I think things played out in a really interesting fashion from there. Obviously, Novak was going to be a big theme of the book, because in the title, Changeover kind of gets at the idea that we had the big three era transitioning possibly into this big two era, but you still have Novak kind of as the bridge between those eras. And the way he played in the Olympics for that gold medal, he's still relevant. He is still looming over the sport in a very big way. And we've seen him gear up with Andy Murray for Australia. So we'll see what he's got for 2025. That was kind of the premise. Wanted to follow a rivalry from a very early stage and kind of tell the first chapter of that story.
Yeah, it's great timing, and also like what a season it was. Like it was really fascinating to watch. Like for a while, like people were talking about like Alcaraz is just running away with everything. He's just gonna win like 3 slams a year, like Fed for a while, But then you had that Sinner evolution, and it happened quite like I would not say maybe drastically, but it felt sudden, because he won like the Davis Cup, he beat Novak, and then just things opened up somehow, and he couldn't lose for a while. It seemed like it was pretty like a pretty stark like contrast to how he played before. It seemed like.
Absolutely. From some of his fans online call it a post-puke Sinner. So after he threw up at Beijing last year, I think that was the Dimitrov match, it seems like he forgot how to lose for a long time. And it was ended up being a pretty incredible stretch of play that he continued from there. And sort of like you mentioned with the next gen, when you have a player break out and become dominant in the way Alcaraz did, in 2022 and 2023, you're kind of hoping that there's going to be some other peers who can keep up with them. Because as we saw with the big three, you really see the best of them when they are pushed to defend their weaknesses, when they're pushed to develop new tactics. As entertaining as Alcaraz is, it's even better when you have someone who can actually expose what his very few limitations are. So Sinner became that player this year, and it was very interesting to watch. Even though he'd always been good in their specific matchup, he still was losing some of especially in the majors, against other top 10 players. Seems like he made huge strides in terms of his endurance, the way he approached big points. Obviously, the serve would be the most noticeable change between how he played this season and in seasons past.
Yeah, it's impressive how they can keep improving. They're so talented, but they take pretty big leaps, from like one year to another, and that really happened with Sinner and earlier, like you said, with Alcaraz, right? How important do you think like a rivalry like theirs and the Rafa Novak, whatever, is for tennis to do well among other sports?
I think for fans like us, we'll be tuning in regardless, right? But for fans who needs kind of an entry point, it provides a very compelling narrative. So I know lots of people who might not be able to name, three other players from that era of tennis, but they know Federer and Nadal, and they tuned in for the big matches. So I think while real fans of the game dig deep and discover all these smaller storylines, and that's what ends up kind of enriching their fandom, at a higher, more general level, it's always nice to be able to say, here's this rivalry between two generational talents. And not only that, they actually are quite interesting contrasts in terms of their personality on court, the way they either engage the crowd and kind of tap into that sort of fiery showmanship of Alcaraz versus the very cool kind of icy precision of Sinner. I think is just it's good TV. And anytime I get to see them play each other, this year I got to see them play at Indian Wells. It was there were just a couple points in that match where it's just like, this is not ordinary tennis. We're being transported into this other realm. So that's what I'm trying to capture in the book, I think.
Yeah, it's always interesting to have followed like the ice and fire, or like of Borg versus McEnroe, Federer and Nadal, you could argue. And now that these two also seem to have that like calm, collected, you can root for him if that's more your personality type or what you like. Or if you want like a showman like Alcaraz, that's also possible. So you have like that, it's more fun to be a sports fan when there's like a clear contrast between the different teams or the different players.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where you hear kind of the fire and ice comparison over the years, and you're like, okay, maybe this is kind of a cliche. But then the more you watch them, and they even I've heard Sinner describe the rivalry in those terms himself, and it really is an accurate kind of way to describe their dynamic. I've heard Sinner, I think one other aspect that's quite interesting is maybe sets them apart from some other rivalries is that they seem to have a quite friendly relationship. There was a moment in Indian Wells where they had the rain delay, and they actually, waited to walk back to the locker room, and they said that they were just chatting during the rain delay, which is funny if you think about the way some of the other rivals in tennis have treated their relationship with each other. If you think of, let's say, Sampras and Agassi, even decades after they've retired, there's still a lot of beef there. So who knows? It'll be cool to see how this relationship develops. I think sometimes the tennis media gets a little too excited and acts like they're best friends, from what I've heard asking them. And comments they've made. I think they're just good professional colleagues who have a lot of respect for each other. But there is something just exciting about lasering in on a rivalry when it's just beginning. They played their first challenger against each other when they were 15 and 17, and now they're going to be competing for Grand Slams, it seems, for the next decade.
Yeah, there's some definitely similarities with the Roger Rafa, also like starting out friendly, but not friends, like more like professional people in the same sport, but then they turned into like really good friendship because they were playing so much over so many years, like doing exhibitions and stuff. And you can really see that also happening in this relationship, like that it will be probably, unless something really happens, but blossoming, because they're both quite calm, cool. There's not like a Nick Kyrgios, like, you have to throw some shade just to stir up some trouble. They focus on their tennis, they let the tennis talk, and then act very professional. And like, it's hard to poke holes in their personas, like the PR way, right?
Totally. I think they, despite the pretty fascinating contrast in the way they express themselves on the court, I think off the court they conduct things very similarly. It's quite buttoned up, quite professional, quite family oriented to an extent. And there is this feeling that already from this very early stage of their careers, they know that this kind of generational expectation has been put on them. We have to keep everything super on point in terms of the professionalism of our team, which is why it was so interesting to obviously follow the doping controversy with Sinner. And I think if I look back at following the season, it was really in Cincinnati where I started seeing, for both players, and in very different ways, you got to see them both kind of spin a little bit out of control. With Alcaraz, he was struggling with this hardcore stretch post-Olympics. That was the first time I saw him smash his racket. I was there. I wouldn't have believed it if someone just told me, but I was there and watched it with my own two eyes in that Monfils match. And then Sinner wins the tournament, and then within 24 hours, the news of his anti-doping rule violation has become public. So they'd had these very kind of charmed and very PR-friendly seasons up to that point, and things got a little more interesting there. So that was a fun moment to follow.
Yeah, that's pretty like stark contrast from how it's kind of started, and like they're obviously starting their careers, even though they've won already like a couple of slams in Alcaraz 4, right? But what do you think the doping, even if it turns out that they don't do anything about it, like now it's up again to be discussed, maybe for some kind of temporary ban, who knows? What do you think it does to harm his kind of legacy partly, or at least give him a little bit of like something to think about that he doesn't want to think about for the next season?
Yeah, I think the WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, taking another look at this verdict that had been handed down, and they have the capacity to appeal that decision, and it's possible he could still face a suspension from the tour. It seems like Sinner knew that this was going to be a huge interference in his season from basically March, April throughout the season. And meanwhile, the public did not know anything that's going on, but it ended up, he talked about it afterwards, and you can look back and sort of make sense. Like Wimbledon, he had that really sort of woozy kind of out of it performance against Medvedev. And then later he said, I didn't sleep the whole night leading up to that because I was so nervous about how these proceedings were going. So it kind of explains a lot of the interesting ups and downs of his still pretty incredible world number one season. And I think one of the most interesting comments he's made about it is that it cleared up in his mind who his friends were and who his friends were not on the tour. People who took him at his word and people who applied a lot of skepticism, whether that's publicly, in the case of Nick Kyrgios, quite publicly and incessantly. But I think it added a very interesting layer to the season where we didn't know kind of the internal tension that was really hanging over everything. It remains to be seen for WADA to continue this appeal, but it continue to be impressed that he was able to put together the season while undergoing these very time-intensive and resource-intensive processes.
Yeah, do you think that speaks I mean, like, there are always going to be conspiracy theorists and people like Kyrgios is going to jump on like, oh, there's some media here. I can get some more exposure so I can sell something in the future. I don't know. Like, I don't really like to be like, I'm quite open with like, I've always been a curious fan for tennis in a way, but
Yeah.
like this kind of stuff I don't like, whether he's right or wrong, but like, I don't like, it looks like jumping on some bandwagon just to get publicity. And it looks pretty cheesy, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. There was a long time where I thought Kyrgios was quite a good thing for tennis, and I profiled him a few years ago. And I think at the same time, it's very good to have a healthy amount of skepticism about the reasons that players provide when they get into these situations. I think we should apply scrutiny to them, whether that's journalists and the public. But there's also a side of it where it's clearly some self-promotional or self-aggrandizing. And I think we can all tell when that line is crossed. So some of those comments he's made, it's pretty clear he's just trying to launch himself back into relevance. But I don't want to lump that in with a lot of the fair scrutiny that could be applied to the situation, because, let's face it, it's not common for a world number one kind of hitting their peak to find themselves in this sort of a bind. But yeah, I think Nick is sort of like a broken clock. Sometimes he is telling the right time. I thought it was interesting to hear him during the pandemic when he was seeing a lot of his colleagues like go crazy partying and stuff, and he was almost the voice of reason, whereas like, we have to be a little more responsible about how we conduct ourselves in this time. The fact that he is a contrarian 100% of the time means he's going to be a voice of reason some fraction of the time, but also a lot of the time he's just going to be trying to get attention. So I feel like that's what we're seeing now to some extent.
Yeah, so Kyrgios is trying to be on the bad one, kind of, but sometimes voice of reason. When we look at next season, like, do you have any like gut feelings, like having followed tennis for a long time, about who's gonna take the reins first? Is Sinner gonna keep on like hammering because he looked unbeatable towards the end, or are we gonna see a shift?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sinner on hard court is gonna continue to be extremely big problem for the rest of the tour. One of the main dynamics I'm curious about now is whether we'll see a resurgence from Daniil Medvedev, because I just think he's way too talented to be totally left behind by these guys, by these two. That said, one of the pieces I'm working on now has to do with some of the complaints he's made about the tennis ball that's used on tour. He seems to think that basically the way the ball moves through the air has disadvantaged the way he plays tennis, because he plays from deep positions, and it's become harder for him to kind of get that ball accelerating through the air and to get his passing shots. He thinks sometimes the way he talks about it, he feels like he's being specifically targeted by the changes in the game. I don't know how true that is. I've talked to one of the tennis ball manufacturers, and they seem to think that all the quality control measures are exactly what all those standards are exactly what they've been in years past. But whatever the case, he's made a couple modifications to his strings for 2023 to get a little more pop on his shots. But it's clear he doesn't have access to quite the same high-end power that a Sinner and an Alcaraz does. I think he's still pretty incredible in defense, in counterpunching. I think the serve has been the most noticeable drop-off for him, which has made his life a lot more complicated, where he's really fighting on both sides of the ball now, whereas he used to be able to hold serve with great consistency and with one of the better rates on tour. So I want to see if he can continue to interfere with the ascent of these two guys. I think it'll keep things interesting, to be honest. But it's hard not to imagine Sinner dominance on the hard courts and then Alcaraz dominance on the natural surfaces continuing in 2025. I think based on what we saw over the course of that little hard court stretch at the end of the year, Alcaraz still has some things to figure out. He tweaked his backhand preparation a little bit towards the end of the year, which I found quite interesting. It seems like he's the kind of player who's open to experimentation and trying new things without getting too kind of in his head about it, which I think will serve him in the long run. I mean, he's got very few things to improve on from this point, so it's a matter of just these tiny margins. I'd be surprised, basically, if they didn't win 3 of the majors next year between the two of them. But
yeah, I think that's...
Curious what you think.
Yeah, that's a possibility, for sure. I mean, I'm curious to see how Novak approaches the season. I guess he his main goal is to get 25. And if he gets 25, I think maybe he's like, okay, I don't need to care anymore. I'm done. I have the record. Like, I don't need to really work so hard. So maybe for the Australian Open with Murray, he's going to be like super motivated. So there's a chance. And obviously this is the slam he wins the most. So I think there's a chance, but the favorites should remain like Sinner and Alcaraz. I would throw in Zverev because he's been so good in the end of the year, and he looks like he's making subtle improvements all the time. And then he's a very dangerous player. Like, he decides, okay, I'm not going to miss a ball now for 1 hour, and he doesn't, you know. Like you, I'm a little bit disappointed in Medvedev's performance, and I don't know where it is. Like, I mean, the balls, I've done a lot of content on balls as well. Like, it's one of the questions we get a lot, you know, and just recently we did a reel about it, because he's like, okay, there's been something about the felt. I talked to some manufacturers on the podcast and off the podcast, and it's there's something like maybe quality wise for a while that affects them a little bit, but now they're all trying to work on like, how can we improve the QC and the consistency of these pro balls. But obviously, if you can't generate so much, if you have a kind of flat game, you're going to be hurt by a slower ball. So if the ball gets heavy and hard, you're going to get hurt, and you're not going to be able to penetrate the court with your, like, he has like the side swiper backhand and stuff like that. That's
exactly,
that helps, you know, and his forehand is relatively flat. So he's like, he wants the ball to just go a little bit more through, and it doesn't. The serve, I am more doubtful, like it has to do anything with the ball. So I think that's where there may be some mental issue, or like sometimes you get the yips on the serve. Like, I mean, Zverev had that for a while, like double faulting. Sabalenka had it. So that's a question actually to see, like, how, because I also noticed like he's not getting 3 points anymore. He has to work so hard.
No.
How do you play like that?
Yeah, and you know, his conditioning is phenomenal, but you reach a point where it's just too much work to do, and you're just fighting into all these tie breaks, and it's. I think this is the season where we started to see maybe, if in the future, as you said, it could be Zverev rising up and Medvedev sort of subsiding, because Zverev's serving, particularly at the end of the year, I saw him in Turin, was just phenomenal. And then with what he has defensively as well, it's just kind of a dangerous combination. And seems to be a tough matchup for Alcaraz so far. And he has admitted that himself. So I think of the non-Sinner, non-Alcaraz players, I feel like he might be the most likely to break through next year. With Novak, as you say, it's definitely a question. The only question is fitness and motivation. Obviously, we're still only 1 year removed from a season where he won 3 of the 4 slams and made the final of the other one. So, and he just beat Alcaraz in a very important match this season. I would never write him off so long as he's motivated. But Zverev, I think, is trending in a more positive direction right now than Medvedev.
What do you think of players? I mean, we can mention like Taylor Fritz, obviously his highest ranking in his career. American hope, you know, to bring some life back into American tennis. Like, I mean, American tennis is doing fine, like results wise, but there always just talk about like pickleball and like the lack of the mainstream interest, which I'm not sure how true it is, but it's there in the lingo, right? And we also have like a guy like Tsitsipas who's been dropping a little bit from what you expect from him, kind of.
Yeah, I think with Fritz, I got to watch his first match against Sinner in Turin, and he really is kind of a world-class ball striker on both sides of the ball. What he gives up against a player like Sinner, obviously, his movement. That's no surprise. Fritz has improved his movement a lot, but still laterally, you can kind of wrong foot him in a way that you'll just never see Sinner getting off balance. But I thought that match in Turin was one of the best performances the first one they played was one of the best performances I've seen from him. And if I remember correctly, he still lost 6-4, 6-4. But I think against the majority of the tour, it's a pretty dangerous package between his serving and his ability to hit so cleanly off both sides. So I think what we saw from him versus Sinner is still going to hold. I don't know how he gets the edge in that matchup. Just because he lacks what Sinner has on return and in defense. But I think he'll remain kind of in the top 6 of the tour. And I wouldn't be surprised if he continues to make these very deep runs at the majors. Tsitsipas is an interesting case because in the pre-Sinner, pre-Alcaraz era, he really looked like he was going to be one of the main guys over this next decade. I think the specific matchup he has with Alcaraz causes him a lot of stress. He used to be pretty comfortable in the center matchup, but that's gotten more complicated. I just think some of the technical limitations of his game maybe are getting exposed by these players where for a one-handed backhand guy, he's never had a elite slice. I think return of serve continues to be a huge issue. I still think he has one of the best forehands around, and sometimes he doesn't get enough credit for that. But yeah, you want to see a lot more defensive ability and ability to neutralize from the backhand side. And it really just sometimes feels like he's blocking it back into play. I think he probably knows what there is to improve. The question is whether he can actually do that. Return of serve has been an issue for a couple seasons now.
Yeah, that's a well put. Do you have any other ones outside those I mentioned? Like, do you think like they will, even if they don't maybe compete for slams, they might be doing like a good rise in the rankings or be a threat, like to maybe knock someone out in their slam?
Yeah, it's even though it wasn't quite this overall as a season wasn't as strong as I expected, I think if you catch Ben Shelton on a good serving day, especially on a hard card, it's going to be really tough. I have always felt that I'm trying not to get too excited about a player in the early phase of their career, but I think the ball striking we're seeing from Fonseca reminds me a lot of Sinner. I don't know if he's going to be quite ready to compete next year, but I think 2 years from now, I'd be quite surprised if he wasn't in the top 10 and making these serious runs at slams. I would look at some of the other top 10 and I think Ruud will continue to be a threat on clay, but hard to imagine him pushing through these guys on the other surfaces. Rublev, I feel like we kind of know what the limitations of his game are. It's a very dangerous game in the right circumstances, but hard to project him breaking past this barrier. Any players that come to mind for you? I'll keep thinking about the question.
No, I think Fonseca was a good shout. Like, I think the next generous, like even the Czech guys, the Mensix and Lehečka, maybe if they get something through, like they're really dangerous, like, because they're quite aggressive ball strike, like flat, like in the Verdic school, but a bit more modern, right? And I think it's not like a guy you want to see in the draw. Same with like Mpechi Pericard, like with the serve and like the aggressive game. Like, he might not be so consistent as some of the other players, but you don't want to see him, in a Wimbledon like quarterfinal or even third round, whatever.
Totally,
it's horrible.
Yeah. Watching Mpechi Pericard this year was kind of an eye-opening experience to me. Getting to see the serve up close was incredible, and then I watched his match against Nishioka, which is one of the great contrasts in height and game style that I think I've ever seen. So yeah, I think that's a great shout when you have a serve that good. And something that's interesting with this serve is I saw a graphic, I think, from Tennis Insights that showed it was kind of comparing, let's call it precision versus power. So how close you are to the corners versus the power. And he was having pretty incredible results with pure power without taking too much risk by playing the ball close to the line. So I think that's a very valuable skill where you can have a really damaging first serve without taking on too much risk with the placement. And I think that's going to serve him really well, obviously on grass, as we've already seen, but certainly on other surfaces as well next year.
Yeah, he feels like a dangerous player, but also kind of like somewhat fun to watch. Not all like serve bots or whatever you want to call it has been like, oh wow, this is a good watch. But he's quite explosive and can really strike from the back of the court as well, right?
Yeah, and really nice touch in the front court. I really liked watching him. My favorite match I got to see him play was against Korda at Wimbledon, where I believe they went, forgot how many sets it was. Definitely a long one, a lot of rain delays. Yeah, you could just see Korda, despite being so technically clean from the baseline, was having to deal with Pericard getting to net and pulling off these really beautiful, touch volleys time after time. Unlike a lot of those serve bots past, I think he does have that kind of explosive quality that you mentioned, where he can really get himself to net and play some nice athletic shots there. So he's a fun one to watch. I hope he doesn't get lumped in with some of the serve bots who aren't as fun to watch in the past.
No, I think he has maybe some staying power of his own. We'll see. But like it's a more risk of an injury when you're quite like a big guy and like 2 meters and and he's more like stocky, broad-shouldered, like muscly than some of the other guys. So. But we'll see. I mean, I really like watching him. Like usually, I'm not like a big fan of big servers, but this guy has something a bit extra, so it'll be fun.
Yeah, I think it's interesting we haven't even brought up Holger Rune yet.
Nah,
it's been kind of a slump for him, but there was certainly a time where he was sort of expected to be in the same tier as the Sinner and Alcaraz. I'm curious what you think. I feel like he hasn't really discovered his total identity as a tennis player yet. He has a lot of potential directions he could grow into, and I think the technical foundation is really strong, which is why I'm still pretty optimistic about him overall. There aren't that many players who are that fundamentally sound from the forehand and the backhand. I just feel like I watch him play these points, and it's not always clear in my mind, maybe in his mind, what his plan of attack is. But you know, he still has accomplished some pretty huge things, and he's still quite young. So,
yeah, it's funny that he's already out of the conversation a bit. Like, it's not top of mind, but that can obviously change. Like, he has a huge game. Like I said, his potential is very impressive. But then, either through like a coach or something, it seems like he's not, like you said, not really having the game plan. And then when you start losing some matches that you expect to win, then your belief is gone as well. And I think that really becomes like a mess in your head. And then he's like, you are on like the Olympus, you're winning Paris Masters, and then you're kind of like, oh, I'm struggling now. I should be Alcaraz too here, you know, like what's going on? So yeah, I think he needs to kind of reboot and reset and start from scratch a bit, you know, and try to rebuild his confidence, because like right now, nobody really talks about him as a slam winner, or even like really going that deep, because the results have not been there. So.
Yeah, I think it's he certainly wants to be in this, and that I think he even said it this summer. He wants there to be a big three again with him and Jannik and Carlos. But I think he's got a lot of work to do to make that happen. But I like another young player, Arthur Fils, I think is moving in the right direction as well. It was quite interesting to see Fonseca beat Fils this week. You know, that is the next gen format, so it has its own quirks. But he also beat him in Rio this year, so that's 2 wins over now a guy who's in the top 20. So I think that's pretty cool.
Since I test rackets partly for a living, I get new rackets, and they're like coming from the States. They need like custom stuff. I'm like, oh, anyway.
That's cool though. What rackets did you just get?
Now it's like a Hazel. It's like a made in Australia. Like he makes rackets. He strings at the Australian Open and stuff like this. So now this is kind of like a small brand. But now for this season, like there's like January, there's so many releases, like E-Zones, Wilson Clash, Head Gravity. There's all of them are like out at the same time. So like my house is full of boxes, you know, like, and then I went to California in November just to like start the testing. So it's a busy period. It's fun, but it's kind of busy. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. I imagine this is like a big time for testing.
Yeah. They want to release like their stuff, the Australian Open, like to time it so that people are like top of mind. And of course, the pros, they get the rackets shipped in the new cosmetic, right? So they would be endorsing this racket, and people will see like, oh, look at this, the Radical is this color now. And then the people start Googling and stuff like that. So it's like everybody wants to be top of mind. And it's something where obviously we won't have like a new model for Sinner or Alcaraz next year. They're playing with the 2023 and 2024 versions of their rackets, but it's going to be big for some other players like Fritz and Zverev, for example.
Yeah, that would be maybe that's a good transition.
Yeah, it's a pretty good segue.
Into the next topic. Yeah, because I feel been following these two players pretty closely this season. I think I understand them to some extent as people and in terms of their tactics. But one thing I want to learn more about is kind of the technical specs of their rackets and their strings, and I want to understand better the relationship between their racket and string decisions and the style of play they have on the court. I think in Cincinnati, I spoke to the stringer, and I just saw Sinner's setup there. So, but of course, there's the paint jobs. That's a separate question. I've asked both the racket companies if they could confirm the true frame under the paint job, and naturally they would not disclose that. But I think there are some pretty good guesses out there, something even better than a guess maybe. So maybe just walk me through what are the true rackets underneath the paint jobs for both these guys.
Yeah, the trickiest one to disclose is Carlitos. Like if we start there, because he could be using like it's the same mold between the previous generation of the Aero 98, which is called the Aero VS, very popular frame among pros, and then also guys like on lower level pros like futures, challengers. So he could be using that one, or he could be using the same mold but a slightly softer layup, like what's inside the racket, which is the new Aero 98, which you can go and buy in a store. And his racket is quite light for a level player that he is. People really like. I did a video maybe a year back or so, because my friend knows him, and he was like swinging his racket, testing it a little bit, and he said it's so light, like it's like a stock racket, and I got hammered in some forums and stuff. No, it's no way he plays with a stock racket. All the pros add like loads of lead tape to the rackets, but it's actually been shown that it's pretty much a stock racket he's playing. Like whether it's the Aero VS or the Aero 98 that's inside, it's impossible to know unless you're working for Babola, really. Like, so it's or if you hit it. I would know if I hit them because I have both, right? But you wouldn't be able to tell exactly, although the differences is very, very minor. So it's not going to be a huge thing. Some people prefer the Aero 98, which is also what I use for as a player, and then the Aero VS is a bit firmer, so a little bit more like old school in feel. The Aero 98 is a bit more muted. But like the weight's like 305 grams, like unstrung, no strings, and like pretty decent balance, 31.7 centimeters. And then you have like the unstrung swing weight, which is like 293. So like if you add strings and overgrip, you're going to get like around 330 grams and a 32.45 centimeter balance and 327 swing weight. And that's like that's a racket that most like club players can actually play with, right? So the reason I think he's playing with this, like it's a spinny, semi-powerful, fast swinging racket. And it's one of those rackets that unless you swing it really fast, you're not going to control the ball that well, because like it really responds to a spin. And it's kind of like almost made for his game. It wasn't really, it was around there before, but he's like the perfect ambassador for this racket. It's kind of fascinating how that happened, and you have two other players who are great ambassadors as well for this frame, but using it other specifications, and that's Fils and Holger Rune, both using the same mold there. So in Alcaraz's case, like the way he takes back, the how fast he swings and how much explosivity he has in his movement and his racket swings, I think he cannot play really much heavier. Like this would be problematic for him. Then you can question, like he has had elbow issues. He's always wrapped his elbow. Is it like the way he hits the ball? Is it his explosive like nature on the court? Maybe the strings, if we get into strings, like, I mean, before Wimbledon, he's changed strings. So he was using RPM Blast, 130 gauge. So similar to Rafa, but like a little bit thinner. Like Rafa used a super thick one, but he used like a semi-thick one, and at 55 pounds in the main strings and 53 pounds 51 pounds in the cross strings. That's supposed to help add a bit more spin to the ball, and he's changed now to a softer version of RPM Blast, which is a very popular string on tour. But this one is quite new and not so well known. Like it's called RPM Team. And when I saw it, like having worked in gear for a long time, I was a bit surprised. I'm like, why would he go softer? But could be elbow, could be that he just wants more court penetration. Maybe he's had the same thoughts like Medvedev, like the balls are a bit deader. I need a bit more. Like most pros you see testing things, it's like they want more pop. So they like, I want to hit through the court. Like they can control with spin, so they want to hit through the court. So that could be a possible reason for him. And I actually saw him now in off season swinging one racket strung with, I think, RPM Power, which is an even more powerful string. So I think he's trying to tweak and look for like, how can I get a bit more? Like I really want to like maybe a bit softer on the arm, but also like a bit more power. So that's quite interesting. Like he's one of those players that has like close to like a racket you could just go out buy in the store, but obviously he plays a little bit better than most club players.
That is very interesting. So it sounds like he was using the Blast and then was experimenting with the team, and then now has been at least trying out the Power in the offseason.
Yeah, I think so. I saw some quick images and it looked like Power, and I think now the offseason is when you try, and I think the string is what he's been a little bit iffy about. I mean, RPM Team work, he won Wimbledon, right? And it worked well for him, but you're always looking for that extra. Maybe something bothered him, like he lost some unexplainable matches, you would argue, and his mind was not there, so it's not really the string. But that end of the season wasn't very crisp, so I think maybe he's looking at like, okay, what can I tweak to get back into a good set and then get even more maybe power or even more on the ball for next year. I think like it's becoming more and more like Formula One, where like equipment isn't like super important because you need to trust your muscle memory and it's what you've used like since you were a junior in many cases. But if you can get some extra from the string setup and maybe just add a bit of weight and stuff, like I think the pros are much more in tune with that like customization and stringing. Like they're much more like, okay, I mean, you have Zverev is one example where he strings in like hectos, right? Like he strings 100 grams. It's the only player on tour I've seen that strings like 21.1 kilos in tension, which is kind of silly, I would argue from my point of view, but in his head that makes a difference. So so that was Alcaraz. If we get then maybe talk about Sinner a bit, because Sinner is quite interesting as well. Like he's not playing a super heavy racket, but he has more weight towards the head. So he plays an older version of the head speed MP. It's called the Graphene Touch. It's the speed that you can find like, I mean, you can buy it used. It's kind of like, it's slightly thinner than the speed that's out on the market now, which is the Oxetic one, Oxetic 2. It's called in Pro Stock lingo TGT 301.4, which tells you like the mold and the layup of the frame. And he has it like at 3. So the strong specs are not like crazy heavy, 325 grams. There's also something, if you hear it, you will say like, okay, I can play with this. Like an amateur could play with it. But the balance is a bit more towards the head, so I think that's where amateurs will be like. I mean, you see his hip whip, I would call it, like he really whips the ball from the hip, and I think that's more like almost towards like a Rafa style balance, where Rafa played like quite even balance, is really where he likes the racket because it slots down in his pat the dog position really easily, and he can really whip. Like if you see his technique, it makes a lot of sense, you know. The way he strikes the ball, the sound as well is just poetic almost. Like he has such a beautiful sound. So 33.3 centimeter balance, which is about like close to 2 points headlight. So it's not like that headlight as most other pros. 340 swing weight, which is a little bit higher. That's the Federer swing weight, strong. And he strings one of the highest tensions on the tour. The way he strikes the ball makes some sense. He has a full bed of a head hawk touch, and that's around 61 pounds, sometimes 62. Maybe he drops a little bit depending on conditions, but that's a high tension. Similar to like maybe Stan Wawrinka, you know, like using like they really hit so hard that they want the racket to be a board to just absorb, like to get some control from the racket. So I don't expect Sinner experimenting a lot with his gear. However, he's for some reason not been happy with the new cosmetics, so he has not changed the cosmetic, although the new model was out for last season. So now people have been seeing some pictures online like, oh, I think maybe for the next season he will play with the 2024 cosmetic, which he completely did not want to play with for whatever reason.
Why do you think that is? Because it doesn't affect, obviously, how the racket plays.
Sometimes players get into the head that it affects, but some players have an issue. Novak had the same issue, like with white rackets. So they, like when a racket is semi-white or predominantly white, like Medvedev doesn't seem to care. He plays with Technifiber. Technifiber, they do all the rackets kind of white. Which is a gutsy move. Iga, Medvedev, many other players. But in Novak's case, he didn't like the white, like kind of obstructing his vision a bit, or just like when the light hits it. And Federer didn't like when they had like the tuxedo cosmetics. So it was like black with white on the sides. That's what he had this like where he didn't like that. He wanted to go back to the black, and he did. And this is kind of the biggest headache for the manufacturers. They're like, oh, here you go, new cosmetic. Play with this. We're going to sell a bucket load of these. And then the player is like, I don't like it.
So that's so fascinating for me.
Like maybe the contrast of the colors can be an issue, but I think like sometimes they can. There are different theories. Like I'm not saying what I don't know. Like I haven't asked Roger, but partly your vision can be a little bit like if a light hits the white area, like your reflection can get into your eye. Like it can be a bit distracting. You know, like that's what I heard. Some players feel like a whiter racket like signals the shot more to the opponent. What am I trying to do with my racket? Where the racket is more than if you have a more like black or gray or a little bit duller cosmetic, right? So that's I've heard as well. I'm not sure that's really something that they think about. But some pros just sense like this. The racket plays differently, whether it's in their head or they have some. I mean, they've hit 1 million balls with the same racket, and then they get a new batch of rackets. And like I really feel like the stiffness, this is a theory, but like I feel like sometimes the feel can change based on the cosmetic. And my buddy here in Spain, he paints rackets like for a living, right? For pros and non-pros and companies and stuff. And he says like the paint effects, right? Like glossy paint plays differently, but a lot of it is head games, of course. Like some pros, I think if you talk about Fritz, for example, he's played with the same spec for so long. He plays with like a really low-powered, nice feeling racket, 95 square inch, huge leverage from his arms, of course, and can generate so much power despite the controlled racket. But he's a guy, like, from what I've heard, that he's just like, give me just a racket. Like, give me the same racket. I don't, he doesn't care about the paint or whatever. It's like, no, I don't care. Well, for some players, I think the cosmetic, like how it looks, how if it plays differently. Like Rafa was really not into switching to this new Rafa cosmetic. He had maybe like fond memories of the previous one, or he really felt like it did play differently. I don't know, but he was reluctant, and then Babla had like poured a lot of money into, like, here we have a new cosmetic. It's a Rafa origin. It's like your signature model, and then you're not playing with it. Like, what's up, man? Like, it's quite fascinating with cosmetics, because it's such a small, like if at all any difference, it feels like head games, but head games are important on professional tennis tour, right? So
absolutely, that is definitely one thing I've learned is even if something is like a placebo effect, it still matters. It still can affect your psychology and your confidence and your performance. Whatever little edge you can get, you got to keep those edges. With Sinner, I was able to see his stringing specs. At least in Cincinnati, he was playing at 29 kgs, which, as you said, is a higher number than I'm used to seeing. And I like the connection you drew between his kind of whippy playing style and the balance of his racket. That kind of makes sense to me in my head. Pretty cool.
Yeah, because if you see like Alcaraz, like the way his racket is relatively, I would say, easy to swing, easy to play with. But it's like the way he pulls his arm like so far back. He has so much like distance from where the arm is, how he pulls it back, that it's like any heavier racket, I think it would be a problem for his arm partly, but he would not be able to swing it as fast. So he really needs that whippiness, like he did this. Yeah. It suits him quite well, So I think for many pros, if you see how their technique is and their game, like it's paired with the racket, like it's partly affected by the racket they used as a junior, and it's obviously been something that they've worked together with. Like the racket is a part of their arm now. So any switch is why this part of the season is interesting to me. It was like in this space, it's like you're following like who's making a switch and how will it affect their game. That's the most interesting thing. Yeah. Like, will they start doubting their racket? Like, because as soon as you start losing in tennis, everybody who's played a tennis match of any level knows like all kind of ghosts and demons starts popping into your head, and you're like, oh, it's the racket, it's the string, it's the weather, it's I ate a paella, I did this, there's a million things, like where's the excuse? Because you're not allowed to lose, like that's it in your head, right? So you're like, okay, why am I not performing? There must be some reason,
right?
So it's a fascinating topic, I find.
One question I had is with Alcaraz, one of the trademarks of his game is the incredible touch. I'm wondering, what role does the frame play in that?
Yeah, I think this racket is a racket that has really good feel, like, and it gives you room, partly thanks to the specs being a little bit lighter. I think it gives you room to be a bit more of a magician and be a bit more handsy in a way. You can change up, like he does that drop shot, like, right? That's the famous Alcaraz. Yeah. Everybody who's doing drop shots now is like, oh, I'm Alcarazing it today. Like, well, if you overdo it, especially, something I talked with my tennis friends about, like, but. So yeah, when he prepares, like, and then he can just change, that's like, it's kind of his trademark now. And I think like having a spinny but controlled racket, like really helps that, like, because he can really put the ball on a dime and he can get that nice, like loop, like a bit of a launch on the ball, and then it just drops. So that's why I feel like, you could not, sometimes you can see pros, and I work with some pros, and sometimes you can see a pro, like they don't really, that racket doesn't make 100% sense. But in both of these guys' cases, I would say it makes a lot of sense. So there's not like, you cannot think of another racket that would suit them better in any way, even in like a fictional scenario, of course. But
so the lighter racket kind of helps him, on the one hand, like do these big swings through big amounts of space, and then also allows him to kind of manipulate the racket face at the last second in the way that allows him to, pull off all these kind of deceptive shots.
Yeah. I think so. And a curious thing about his racket, which is something like, it's funny because like obviously people buy rackets after what their heroes play with, or like if he plays with it, it must be good, so I'm going to buy it, And he plays with an L4 grip. That's a pretty large grip, like also by tour standards. And he's not like Pericard. Like he's a pretty average like height guy and build. And Rafa played L2, and Rafa is like similar, a bit bigger, So it's quite interesting that he uses an L4 when most people use L2, L3. So, but it's like something with the way he's holding the racket or the way he feels comfortable. But it's very rare to see that. Yeah.
It is very interesting. I guess on the flip side there, Sinner has talked about how, adding a little more feel and touch to his game is one of his big goals. Do you think his racket specs serve those goals, or do you think it might make it harder?
Yeah, the interesting thing with feel is obviously muscle memory is the most important part, because you know the racket, you're kind of communicating with the racket. I think it doesn't come 100% natural to his game, because he's like it feels like he's metronomic in the way he strikes the ball, right? So I think it's tough to be a player that mixes up stuff when you're so good at just doing, keeping it on the baseline, and nobody's going to out hit you from there. Like he's like a Djokovic with extra pace, right? So I think that makes it trickier. It's maybe not the most touchy-feely setup, like with this kind of very high string setup, like very stiff, like it's a board in a way, right? So you don't gonna have a little pocketing of the ball in the string bed. It's more made for him being able to just like pummel the ball with his rotation. So I think it doesn't quite suit his game to be also like his personality, maybe that's kind of flair and touch, And the racket is maybe not also made for that. It's made for bashing hard from the baseline, So it really shows again, like he has his racket that matches style and personality and everything in a way, right? Because it's like it works as a unit for him.
That's very interesting. Do you feel like one question I've liked asking people is, in what ways do you think these guys are kind of advancing things from the Big Three era? And maybe just because of the conversation we're having now, do you think any of the technical decisions they've made reflect some new trend that we're going to see going forward?
That's interesting. Like, I think the trends seem to be mainly in strings, like that people are trying, like it always seems to be like moving now, power, right? Like I could see Sinner going down in tensions even more, like maybe to get even more power or even better feel maybe at some point. But overall, like I'm the most, what I'm seeing the most is people like either where it's due to balls or just how the game is changing because it's so much more powerful and everybody can generate so much pace from a dead ball. I think it's like everybody's looking, how can I get a bit more out of the racket? Just a bit more power, a bit more depth, like more for free. It's rare to see these guys that come and play with like the Murray setup, like this kind of thing. And I would not even be surprised to see Djokovic do like a small tweak more just to get a bit extra. I mean, Murray did like a very dramatic one towards the end of his career, but it's curious. I think like that's the trend. But then we have the young guys like Basavaredi, like he comes in and he has a controlled, like slightly extended frame,
Is it the Prestige?
It's an older Prestige from like 2012, yeah. And it's slightly extended. Right. So he plays Novak. His biggest idol, I guess, is Novak, from what I heard. And he plays Novak tennis. Like his backhand is so good, like backhand and returns, like the insane level of those. So I think that suits him, like he knows exactly where the ball is going. He's a good mover. And anytime he has a chance on the backhand, he just pounces, right? So.
Yeah, I love, as you say, the racket is extension of the arms. Like the game style develops in parallel with the racket. So anytime they are making these tiny little tweaks, it's like, who knows what the butterfly effect could be from there. I think with Sinner and Alcaraz going head to head there, it's going to be a bit of an arms race as they each try to find out how they can find some new advantage. You got to think that the technical specs will be one aspect of that as well.
Yeah, I find it fascinating with like the technical specs, but also like, okay, what can they add to the coaching team? We saw like, for example, Hurkacz added like Lendl and Nicolas Massou, which is like, wow, how do they work together with two star coaches, and like Lendl being the biggest star maybe. But then you will see like, okay, Sinner seems happy with his team except for this incident we had with the massages and stuff, but now he's sorted that out. And Alcaraz is so reliant on Ferrero, like what can he do to maybe, in case Ferrero is not there, be more independent? Like how can he be more of an independent thinker on the court and not be so maybe reliant on having Ferrero like sit there and say something? And so that's kind of fascinating as well. Like what will they bring to add? Maybe like how do I deal with like fast hard courts indoor tennis in Alcaraz's case? Like can I bring another coach to help me navigate that? So yeah, that stuff is also fascinating in this kind of rivalry.
Yeah, one of the interesting things I was able to ask him about in Turin is he kind of changed his take back for his backhand. So he was, instead of kind of having in a more vertical position, he was kind of dropping it down directly. And I was asking, is that a tweak you made for the faster surfaces? And he was like, and I asked him, is that something your coach told you to do? And he was like, sometimes I just start testing something out. I didn't ask Juan Carlos, I didn't ask anyone, and it was feeling really good. So I just kept going with it. We'll see in like preseason if I want to keep going with it or change it up again. I found it pretty compelling that someone, still early in his career, who seems so reliant on his coach in some ways, still has a lot of confidence in his own feel and his own way to assess his own game. So I just think that's a good mindset to have when you're 21 and you've already won 4 slams and you're willing to test out new things, trial and error.
Yeah, I think that's what makes him also fascinating as a person. Like, because they both these guys, obviously they love tennis. You can't be that good without loving tennis, but they're still so young in their process of like developing as a player. And you, like you said, when you see them play live or on TV, whatever, but it's like you never saw tennis like this. They're like, how can they hit so hard and move to the ball and keep doing it for 30 shots? Like, it's just ridiculous. Yeah. So you're like, is this table tennis or what is this game? So it's funny.
And that connects to something I've been wondering about, where do you think that, what we're seeing on screen when they play each other and how kind of out of control, out of this world it seems, do you think that is more a product of, let's call it like strength and conditioning gains or technical gains, or do you think it is more of a technological thing?
I think it's strength and conditioning helps, of course. Like, if you go far back, the strings technology is the biggest impact, I think, more than rackets. Obviously, the rackets are a bit easier to use, get a bit more power. But like in Fritz's case, for example, and like Djokovic, and they play with kind of old school rackets, so they can still like generate that. But it's a combination, I think. Like it's you're seeing like tennis evolve to tennis 3-point with these guys. I think it's like a really clear evolution of like, you think, I can't get better, and Federer and Rafa and Novak, they can't get better. But like, oh yeah, they made it better. Like they are already better players, and they're like, it's so impressive to watch. Like, what is the next thing? Like, how can it get even faster than this? Like, that's it's kind of a weird situation in a way that you like question, like, where does tennis go after this? Because the level is so high. But I guess there's always another level.
It does make you think, like, the speed of the game is getting to a point where, can human beings can the reflexes move any faster than they are currently? And the swings covering huge amounts of space in such a rapid amount of time is just so dynamic and athletic. I think that's what first captured me about this rivalry, and it's going to be amazing to see what happens when they actually get into their physical primes. It's still so early, right? 21, 23. Athletically, somehow they're going to improve from here.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to watch. So what about your book, like Changeover? When will it be out? Like, the cover looks really cool. Like the cover. It's kind of a more retro vibe, which I prefer.
Yeah.
So what's the story? What can people expect, and where will they be able to check it out?
Yeah, so it can be pre-ordered now at Simon & Schuster. I can send you the link if you want to attach it to the episode,
so people can check it out.
The current plan, which could be subject to change, the current plan is to have it out before the US Open 2025. So it's going to be a book focused on kind of the developments of the 2024 season, but looking forward really just to the rest of these guys' careers. So currently hard at work on it, and still, as with interviews like this, learning new things every day. So hope to put some of the wisdom I've heard from other people into this book so that you guys can read it for the time for the US Open next year.
Is this kind of like a life goal of you to write a book? Like, you wrote any books before? Or?
This is the first book for me. Yeah, I think I've been writing about tennis professionally now for about 6 years, but I think this was a big change because with the book, I had more resources where I could actually travel to a lot of the tournaments and, interview these players in press conferences and just go up to the stringer and talk to them about what these specs are. So it was a very different experience for me to actually be on tour. And even then, it's only a fraction of what these guys do. I only made it to maybe 9 or 10 events this year, but it made me appreciate how draining that lifestyle can be. But it was a goal of mine to write a book one day, and I wanted to find a subject matter that would be exciting enough to me that it could actually fuel the writing of a whole book. And it was that moment when I saw them playing at the US Open 2 years ago where I was like, I actually think this is something that I want to focus my attention on and can maybe write 200 pages about. So, so far, it still remains a fascinating topic to me. And hopefully by the time I'm done writing it, I can say the same.
Yeah, we'll be excited to watch this year and follow your progress. And then when we're closer to launch, we'll happily do another call or do some marketing for your book. I will happily read it for sure, because it's a fascinating topic for me as well, having followed tennis for so long. And then these two guys kind of, when you're most worried at like what's happening after Roger and Rafa and Novak and like what's happening, and then, oh, we're in good hands, it's fine.
Yeah, it was interesting how quickly that happened, where it's like you have this moment of crisis where it's like, are people really gonna follow this once these three guys fade out? And then there actually was very little time in between. The changeover kind of happened seamlessly in 2024. I think the sport, people can get stressed about their legends fading out, but there are always incredible talents coming in, and it seems like these two are at the front of the pack.
Yeah, that's a great way to end the pod. Yeah, thanks, Giri. I really appreciate your time. Sorry about the technical issues, but it happens.
No
I guess when you're doing remote, it's always better to do it in person,
Yeah.
but it's tricky. So your schedule, are you going to any tournaments in the near future, like early 2025?
So at this point, it's going to just be focusing on writing, and then I'm having my first child in 2025 as well. So I want to be home and enjoying that. It was a busy year of travel for me in 2024, but it's going to be more watching tennis from the sofa in 2025. And then maybe when the book comes out, and I get a little more comfortable with the rhythm with my new home life, maybe I'll go back on tour a little more the year after, but looking forward to some downtime with the family as well.
Sounds good, man. Congrats on the baby, and all the best now for 2025.
Thanks so much. And I really appreciate all your insights. I learned a lot today.